In this representation, the movement of human and divine law finds its necessity expressed in individuals in whom the universal appears as a pathos, and the activity of the movement appears as the action of individuals, which gives the appearance of contingency to the necessity of the activity. But individuality and action constitute the principle of individuality as such, a principle which in its pure universality was called inner divine law. As a moment of the visible community, its activity is not confined merely to the underworld or to its outer existence, but it has an equally visible existence and movement in the actual nation. Taken in this form, what was represented as a simple movement of the individualized pathos acquires a different look, and the crime and consequent destruction of the community acquire the proper and characteristic form of their existence. Human law, in its universal existence, is the community. In its activity in general is the manhood of the community. In its real and effective activity is the government. It is, moves, and maintains itself by consuming and absorbing into itself the separatism of the penates, or the separation into independent families presided over by womankind, and by keeping them dissolved in its fluid continuity of its own nature. But the family is, at the same time, in general, its element, the individual consciousness the basis of its general activity. Since the community only gets an existence through its interference with the happiness of the family, and by dissolving individual self-consciousness into the universal, it creates for itself, in what it suppresses and what is at the same time essential to it, an internal enemy, womankind in general. Womankind, the everlasting irony in the life of the community, changes by intrigue the universal end of the government into a private end, transforms its universal activity into a work of some particular individual, and perverts the universal property of the state into a possession and ornament for the family. Woman in this way turns to ridicule the earnest wisdom of mature age, which, indifferent to purely private pleasures and enjoyments as well as to playing an active part, only thinks of and cares for the universal. She makes this wisdom an object of derision for raw and irresponsible youth and unworthy of their enthusiasm. In general, she maintains that it is the power of youth that really counts. The worth of the son lies in his being the lord and master of the mother who bore him, that of the brother as being one in whom the sister finds man on a level of equality, and that of the youth as being one through whom the daughter, freed from her dependence on the family, obtains the enjoyment and dignity of wifehood. The community, however, can only maintain itself by suppressing this spirit of individualism, and because it is an essential moment, all the same creates it, and moreover creates it by its repressive attitude towards it as a hostile principle. However, this principle, being merely evil and futile in its separation from the universal end, would be quite ineffectual if the community itself did not recognize the power of youth, the manhood, which, while immature, still stands within the sphere of individuality, as the power of the whole. For the community is a nation, is itself an individuality, and essentially is only such for itself by other individualities being for it, by excluding them from itself and knowing itself to be independent of them. The negative side of the community, suppressing the isolation of individuals within it, but spontaneously active in an outward direction, finds its weapons in individuality. War is the spirit and the form in which the essential moment of the ethical substance, the absolute freedom of the ethical self from every existential form, is present in its actual and authentic existence. While on the one hand, war makes the individual systems of property and personal independence, as well as the personality of the individual himself, feel the power of the negative, on the other hand, this negativity is prominent in war as that which preserves the whole. The brave youth in whom woman finds her pleasure, the suppressed principle of corruption, now has his day, and his worth is openly acknowledged. Now it is physical strength and what appears as a matter of luck that decides on the existence of ethical life and spiritual necessity. Because the existence of ethical life rests on strength and luck, the decision is already made that its downfall has come. Just as previously only the penates succumbed to the national spirit, so now the living spirits of the nation succumb through their own individuality and perish in a universal community, whose simple universality is soulless and dead, and is alive only in the single individual, qua single. The ethical shape of spirit has vanished and another takes its place. In this very lengthy paragraph number 475, we are almost at the end of this second subsection of the first portion of the massive spirit section of the work. What Hegel has been doing is working out this dynamic between the human law and the divine law and those who represent both of them throughout these two sections. And now we're at the point where we're going to see both of them succumb and be replaced by another understanding of law, which is going to be that worked out in the next section. So first we have to actually get all the way through to the debacle or the catastrophe of this law that was supposed to be doling out or divvying up the ethical substance, and which ended up, we saw conflicts arising not only within the society itself, but even in each of these laws. So Hegel says in this representation, in this Vorstellung, right, the movement of human and divine law finds its necessity expressed in individuals. We've seen this as a key idea, in whom the universal appears as a pathos, as a something that's inflicted upon them, you might say. And the activity of the movement appears as the action of individuals. And here's the big problem, which gives the appearance of contingency to the necessity of the activity. So we've already seen this contrast in the earlier paragraphs. Hegel had just highlighted how nature has its sort of cruel sway by introducing contingency, in the shape of the two brothers, where rulership is supposed to be unified. Now he's going to talk about this even more, and Hegel's going to do this in a way that reflects, gender roles as he is understanding them, and as I think he's taking them quite a bit from their representations in ancient Greece. We might, say that perhaps this is something to be itself aufgehoben, to be surpassed, but Hegel is thinking this out in his own time, and he's going to contrast the woman versus the man in terms of the workings of these. The woman is going to be identified with nature here. So he says, individuality and action constitute the principle of individuality as such, a principle which in its pure universality was called inner divine law. And we saw people acting on the behalf of that divine law. Then he says, as a moment of the visible community, its activity is not confined merely to the underworld or to outer existence, but has an equally visible existence and movement in the actual nation. So the divine law, now we saw, is somehow honored or taken into account by the nation. And then he says, in this form, what was represented as a simple movement of the individualized pathos acquires a different look. The crime, the consequent destruction of the community, acquire the proper and characteristic form of their existence. So what does that mean? That's what he's going to be charting out. The crime that the person motivated by divine law, going against the community, going against the government, is now going to be fully, you could say, universalized. So he says, human law in its universal existence is the community, right? That has been the constant throughout this entire section. Human law is the community, and it is for the community. It is manifest to the community. He says its activity in general, and here we get to the gender roles again, is the manhood of the community. Why is that? Well, the community itself, as he's going to point out, this is not something new, is composed of families, right? And those families, each of them has brothers and husbands who leave the family, at least temporarily, become part of the community, and thereby are engaging in this very public normative work, which is essentially male-dominated. And we saw that Hegel has no problem identifying human law with the male and divine law with the female, whether it be the wife in this case or whether it be the sister, as it was in some of the other cases. So he's going to go on and say, okay, human law is the community It's in its activity in general, it is the manhood of the community. In its real and effective activity, it is the government. So the government is not the entire manhood of the community, right? The government is a generally select few. Or if we're talking about something like ancient Athens, after the revolts and the democracy and the giving of laws by Solon and all that sort of stuff, even then it's still a minority. It's not every man in the community. It's the property owners, those who are citizens. It does not include slaves, resident aliens, certain other people as well, even if the franchise is quite wide. We can say something similar about ancient Rome as well. Rome itself goes through all these internal social conflicts about who actually comprises the government. And this can be a contested issue. We saw that discussed just in the last paragraph in terms of the two brothers. Now, what Hegel's interested in here is not that sort of civil war. He's interested in the relationship of the families, which are essentially led or governed by women, to the larger community, and then what its implications are for the youth. So he goes on and he says, it maintains itself by consuming and absorbing into itself the separatism of the penates, or the separation into independent families presided over by womankind, and keeping them dissolved in the fluid continuity of its own nature. The government and the community as such is really only functional as a community when it doesn't allow the family to have its entire possible sway. What do we mean by that? When the family attains a certain amount of independent power and it's not being directed into the community, but rather is appropriating parts of the community or even appropriating the government to itself, then we're going to have a problem. Then we're going to have what Hegel here is denoting as individualism. He doesn't necessarily mean the individualism of what we think of as modern radical individualism, but rather a sort of, well, look, everybody's in it for their own sake, so we're going to get ours. This can lead to faction when the families are powerful enough, right? And they have lots of clients and allies within the state. So he goes on and he says, the family is, at the same time, in general, its element. The family is the element of the community. The individual consciousness, the basis of its general activity. You cannot get away, in Hegel's view, from family organizations. As much as the state, as much as the government, as much as the community might like to do that, and may in fact have philosophers who spell out utopian plans for replacing the family with other institutions, that's not going to work. And so the community has got to figure out how it's going to relate itself to these families. Now notice what he says after this. Here we go. Since the community only gets an existence through its interference with the happiness of the family, and by dissolving individual self-consciousness into the universal, it creates for itself in what it suppresses and what is at the same time essential to it, an internal enemy. Hegel is not saying, let's be very clear here, Hegel is not saying that women are automatically an enemy to the state or anything like that, or that they're, just trouble and watch out for them. He's saying because of the action of the community, of the government in particular, in making sure that families don't get too big and strong and independent and provide their own sort of locus in which meaning that would ordinarily take place within the community is going to happen. Because they do that, they create women as their enemy. They render them their enemy. And so what happens here? There's a new dynamic. He says, womankind, the everlasting irony in the life of the community. Isn't that an interesting thing to say? Womankind, the everlasting irony in the life of the community. That could be said just as well by somebody like Simone de Beauvoir as by, somebody roughly a century and some decades before her, Hegel. Womankind has this because of being not part of the universal community, not being totally acknowledged within it, not having recognition within it, is created as or constituted as some sort of disruptive threat. So he says, womankind changes by intrigue the universal end of the government into a private end. What are we talking about there? Think of what happens in dynastic struggles. The government, whoever is in charge of the community, of the human law and its administration, tends to be, whether we're talking about a monarchy, an aristocracy, or even a democracy, tends to be oriented in terms of the family units. That famous saying behind every, strong man or, man of achievement lies a strong or good woman. There's lots of variations on this. Hegel seems to think that that's actually the case. And we see this perpetually, that because of the way gender roles are differentiated out, both in ancient Greece and Rome and also in Hegel's own time and his views, woman is the one who speaks up for the rights of the family. The woman is the one who says, wait a second, why are we doing all of this stuff, enduring all of these sacrifices, if our family is not going to get some sort of benefit out of ruling? Why are we doing this if we're not going to improve our house? Why are we doing this if we're not going to, say, establish your son as following in your footsteps, O great leader? And because of this, woman is able to, in effect, exercise power within the community and the government. So he goes on and he says, changes by intrigue the universal end of the government into a private end, transforms its universal activity into a work of some particular universal, and perverts the universal property of the state into a possession and ornament for the family. And we could think about this not just in terms of women and men. We could think about this in terms of any involvement of the family within any organization, institution, community large enough to mediate meaning that is supposed to be greater than the family unit. We could think about how this works in all sorts of organizations and institutions. Here, Hegel is interested in the political community, but we might think of all sorts of alternates as well. So he goes on and he says, woman in this way turns to ridicule the earnest wisdom of mature age, which, indifferent to purely private pleasures and enjoyments, as well as to playing an active part, only thinks of and cares for the universal. So the leading men, the senectutes, right? This is what we get senate from. The old men who make the decisions, women make fun of them. They're like, they don't actually know how to rule. And who do they favor? They favor the youth, the young males who are more pliable and who are more driven by what it is that they don't yet have, their desires, who are supposed to be embodying the universal, but are really embodying individualism. So he goes on and he says, she makes this wisdom an object of derision for raw and irresponsible youth and unworthy of their enthusiasm. Hegel is talking, in effect, about a kind of social revolution happening, a social revolution in which the youth are the allies against the older men of the women who run the households. That's what's happening here. So he goes on and he says, she maintains it's the power of youth that really counts. The worth of the son lies in being the lord and master of the mother who bore him, That of the brother as being one in whom the sister finds man on a level of equality. That of the youth as being one through whom the daughter, freed from her dependence on the family, obtains the enjoyment and dignity of wifehood. So the youth is somebody who can be, in effect, used to promote the status of women, whether the youth realizes it or not. And here, Hegel says the community, there's a counter response. The community can only maintain itself by suppressing this spirit of individualism. And because it is an essential moment, all the same creates it. Very interesting point there, right? The more that the community tamps down on this, the less it's able to successfully control it. It's sort of like playing whack-a-mole. If you're not familiar with this game, it's something that you see at American theme parks and carnivals and places where games are played. And it consists in, you have a mallet and you're supposed to whack the mole, and there's a lot of different holes. So it comes up out of this hole and you hit it, you push it down there, and then it pops up over there. You hit it there, pops up over there. Keeps going and going and going. You can never actually get it completely repressed. And Hegel is detailing exactly this sort of dynamic on the part of the community and the government. So he says, creates by its repressive attitude towards it, it is a hostile principle. And this principle, he says, being merely evil and futile in its separation, would be ineffectual if the community did not recognize the value of the youth. Now, what is the youth truly valuable for? This is, again, where we get to talking about revolutions. Revolutions are changes, radical changes in things. Hegel's going to talk about war here. Why do the youth want war? Why are they directed to war? Is it that they are naturally, driven by passion or spirit or thumos or something like that, the way that some ancient Greeks have portrayed it? Not all youths are. Some are, some aren't. Is it that they see war as an opportunity to aggrandize their own power, their prestige, their wealth at the expense of others? That's not enough either. Hegel goes on and he says, the youth is recognized, right, as immature, but as manhood, as the power of the whole. And he says, for the community is a nation, is itself an individuality, and essentially is only such for itself by other individualities being for it, by excluding them from itself and knowing itself to be independent of them. He says the negative side of the community, suppressing the isolation of individuals within it, but spontaneously active in outward direction, finds its weapons in individuality. And then Hegel comes to the point of saying war is the spirit and the form in which the essential moment of the ethical substance, the absolute freedom of the ethical self from every existential form, is present in its actual and authentic existence. What does that sound like if you think back to previous sections of the Phenomenology? Doesn't that sound an awful lot like what was happening in the very beginnings of the self-consciousness section? The conflict, the struggle to the death? It shows, this is how the community shows itself to be absolutely free in its ethical self from every existential form, from every determinate, conditioned form, from any particular life. Who is capable of doing that? The old men? No, it is the youth who can run into the breach, who can see danger and run towards it, who can further the nation and its spirit. So he says, while on the one hand war makes the individual systems of property and personal independence, and as well as the personality of the individual himself, feel the power of the negative. Why is that? Well, because war throws all those things into the balance. If you live on the marches, a march is a land that borders where the enemy are, and the war is declared, you may lose your individual home, you may lose your property, you may lose your life. So there's that negative side to it, right? throws all those things into suspension, into the possibility of being lost. He goes on and he says, on the other hand, this negativity is prominent in war as that which preserves the whole. When you go to war, whether this is really just ideology or, a trickery on the part of the government or the ruling classes or something like that, when you do go to war as a community, there is a sense that you're belonging to something greater than yourself, something transcendent. And that by going out and fighting and risking your life and your property and your status and all these other things, you are becoming the universal, the one who stands in the face of the danger to the community and who represents the community. We do this in a somewhat, sublimated fashion with certain sporting events, don't we? Now, Hegel goes on and he says, the brave youth in whom woman finds her pleasure, the suppressed principle of corruption, right, when the family takes over the government, now has his day and his worth is openly acknowledged. Now it is physical strength and what appears as a matter of luck that decides the existence of ethical life and spiritual necessity. Now notice this is not a triumph in many respects. This is not a triumph for the ethical. Why not? Because the ethical is supposed to have a different sort of necessity. It's not supposed to be just contingent on luck or sheer physical strength or youthfulness or anything like that. The ethical is supposed to be transcendent to that. But what happens instead, he says, because the existence of ethical life rests on strength and luck, the decision is already made that its downfall has come. Once the ethical life of the community depends on the youth at war promoted by the family, promoted by women against the older men and whatever wisdom they happen to have had that Hegel suggests is the case here, things have taken a decisive turn, and you don't get to walk back from that. So he says, just as previously only the penates succumb to the national spirit, so now the living spirits of the nation succumb through their own individuality and perish in a universal community, whose simple universality is soulless and dead, is alive only in the single individual. Who's the single individual? The ruler, the one who decides things. Neither the human law nor the divine law is being respected in this or furthered. They're both being sacrificed to something else. So he concludes here by saying the ethical shape of spirit has vanished and another has taken its place. So what is that other? That's what remains to be seen now.
This ruin of the ethical substance and its passage into another form is thus determined by the fact that the ethical consciousness is directed onto the law in a way that is essentially immediate. This determination of immediacy means that nature as such enters into the ethical act, the reality of which simply reveals the contradiction and the germ of destruction inherent in the beautiful harmony and tranquil equilibrium of the ethical spirit itself. For this immediacy has the contradictory meaning of being the unconscious tranquility of nature and also the self-conscious restless tranquility of spirit. On account of this natural aspect, this ethical nation is in general an individuality determined by nature and therefore limited, and thus meets its downfall at the hands of another. But with the vanishing of this determinateness, which in the form of a real existence is a limitation, but equally the negative element in general and the self of the individuality, the life of spirit and this substance, which is self-conscious in everyone, is lost. The substance emerges as a formal universality in them, no longer dwelling in them as a living spirit. On the contrary, the simple compactness of their individuality has been shattered into a multitude of separate atoms.
Hegel ends this long dynamic that we have been charting out in the last two subsections of this very first portion of Spirit by talking about the ruin of ethical substance,
what is ethical substance giving way to? That's the question that we have here. And how does it happen? Well, we've charted that out, and we've seen this long dynamic between human law and divine law, its representatives, all of that sort of stuff happening in terms of the interplay of what Hegel has called ethical spirit. So he says this passage into another form is determined by the fact that the ethical consciousness is directed onto the law in a way that's essentially immediate. What is this endpoint where the law is going to be immediate? Well, there's going to be a loss of the ethical substance, a loss of the kind of community in which each person could find himself or even herself, although we saw that Hegel has this very rather rigid conception of gender roles within the community and its relationship to the family. So he says that this determination of immediacy means that nature as such enters into the ethical act, the reality of which simply reveals the contradiction and germ of destruction inherent in the ethical spirit itself. And we saw that this is going to be, there's going to be a disharmony between the human law and the divine law. Hegel will go on and say, on account of this natural aspect, the ethical nation is in general an individuality determined by nature and therefore limited. So over here, on the board, I have something different than this, but what we could have here is sort of a preliminary state where now the nation is ruled by one person, by one self-consciousness, whoever that happens to be. And that happens to be a matter of nature, which means contingency for Hegel. There's no longer the kind of equilibrium and every person and portion getting its role, its part, its function within the larger totality. That's all broken up. And instead, Hegel says, not only is it the case that there's going to be somebody who probably shouldn't be in charge by the old way of looking at things in charge, it's not even going to be somebody from that community. He says it meets its downfall at the hands of another nation, or it could be somebody coming in and taking over from the outside. So he says, with the vanishing of this determinateness, which in the form of a real existence is a limitation, but equally the negative element in general and the self of the individuality, the life of spirit and the substance, which is self-conscious in everyone, is lost. The connection is sundered between people as members of this community. What connects them? The fact of being ruled by somebody, being subject. So he says, the substance emerges as a formal universality in them, no longer dwelling in them as a living spirit. Formal means that it's just applying to everybody in the same way, regardless of who they are, not taking account of any of their history or culture or status or relations with each other, just applying to everybody more or less the same. He says, on the contrary, the simple compactness of their individuality has been shattered into a multitude of separate atoms. This is a great way to end it here. When we talk about the atomization of individualism, right? What we're talking about is everyone being split into their own little universe that is somehow still all being connected up together. And none of them have any necessary relation with each other anymore, as was the case over here. So what is going to be coming on the scene? Here Hegel is going to tell us about another kind of law, and that's what happens in the section to come.